I thought that as a solstice ceremony this year, that I would work in an homage to my friend Theodore Sturgeon. When I first gave a public solstice ceremony in 1980, Sturgeon was there, and he was very instrumental in the fact of my coming out. I had been in disguise in Hollywood for 7 years as an entrepreneur. I ran a bookstore right next to Pickwick Books, and never gave lectures, and just never got involved in things, but had built up a clientele. I was known as the Bodhisattva of Hollywood Boulevard, and all of the characters and regulars used to come in, and that was my parish, the weirdos of Hollywood Boulevard, for about 7 years. And in my parish were a lot of the very famous science fiction writers, and especially Sturgeon, who could always get to me, convinced me that I should come out and do something with my background, with my education. And he actually was one of the individuals that convinced me that I should come back and do lecturing. And so that first lecture was given on the Summer Solstice of 1980 at the Philosophical Research Society. I think, were you there, John? Yeah. It was called The Tao of Journeying. And we went into Wallace Stevens and Black Elk and Shantideva, Lao Tzu, and a number of other fellow travelers. And that solstice really reinstated the feeling and the desire to go ahead and teach. So I've been doing that ever since. And 1 year later, on the summer solstice of 1981, Sturgeon was there again. And this time, Sturgeon and his wife both came to help me. And the three of us devised an interpenetrating solstice program. Each of the three of us developed by themselves their own project, but tried to work on empathy and telepathy to make that project mesh with, or capable of meshing with, the other two. But the code was not to say anything out loud, no peeking allowed, so that there'd be no conscious contact, no planning contact, but only what we could find by our empathy. Well, individuals like Sturgeon are tremendously empathetic, not to say telepathic, and he devised the most ingenious kind of part to the program. His wife, Lady Jane Sturgeon, composed a song. It was a poem, a hymn to the sun, and she sang this song to, I think there was a guitar accompaniment.
We have it on tape.
We have it on tape, and I did something from Midsummer Night's Dream. And Sturgeon came up and surprised everyone because he brought a set of bongo drums, and he started playing different rhythms. And he was integrating what she had done and what I had done, not in terms of content, but in terms of musical rhythmic coordination, and was extemporaneously then making up on the spot a little linking prose passage, which was not poetry so much, but prose that fit this spontaneous rhythm exercise. And it was really one of the most gorgeous of all events. We have photographs of it, and we have it on tape. Well, the next solstice, which we, I don't think we, did we hold it there at PRS? The third, yeah, we did. We did the third solstice, but he was unable to be there. Sturgeon lectured all over the world, and very often lectured on writing. He was one of the unsung experts about writing, about expressive form, about literature. Not just the science fiction genre, but he was a master of bringing out the not the human so much, but the humane, and showing that the humane exists even in what we would consider extraterrestrials, or even in what we would consider super people, or mutants, or any time, that the humane was a quality of the universe, that it permeates and penetrates throughout the universe and can be discovered or rediscovered or found wherever our species or any sentient species happen to acquire the simple sense of presence or presencing, the simple sense of being able to be real to themselves where they are as they are. And that this quality that we call the humane will manifest itself there. And that this is very much magic. It's a magical realm to discover that this is so, that the universe in fact has this as a omnipotent quality. And all of his work really were literary exercises to make the most convoluted, labyrinthine stories, plots, literary excursions, so that it seemed beyond hope that one could never discover anything humane in this, and then always show that in fact here it is all the while. And his works, largely short stories, most of his novels were what were called fix-ups. It's the term they use in science fiction. It was invented by Sturgeon. This fix-up idea of taking short stories and putting them together and then making a filler in between them and making a novel out of it that way. His most famous work, of course, is More Than Human, which won the International Fantasy Award in 1954 and is acclaimed as one of the 3 or 4 most famous of all the science fiction novels. And in More Than Human, Sturgeon developed the idea of homo gestalt, that the next evolution in man will not be for the individual, but will be for individuals that find that they together make a superior being. And in this, Sturgeon carries the mystical idea of community one step further, that community does not just exist as an aggregate of individuals, but that there is, at a certain flashpoint, an interpenetration of individuals so that they become a single unity. And thus, More Than Human is the story of how the first Gestalt being comes into manifestation. It's a marvelous story, quite excellent. Well, Sturgeon brought out in me, he died about 10 days ago, almost 2 weeks ago now. He was very fragile in his respiratory system, and he was lecturing at the university in Hawaii, and the humidity there got to him. He went home to Springfield, Oregon, and he died there about 2 weeks ago. He was 67. Sturgeon brought out of me the magical background that I had, that I hadn't given much thought to. I hardly ever have thought about it, and hardly have ever brought it out to myself and made it conscious. It's always just occurred. And Sturgeon was one of the few individuals that I was able to talk with at great length and in great depth. And he noticed one time on my hand that I have a very peculiar scar on my right hand. And he got me to tell the story of how that had come about. And it turns out that when I was born in a part of Michigan, a little General Motors town called Saginaw, where they make steering gears for the GM cars. And if you look at a map of Michigan, it's shaped just like a hand with the thumb up. And the place of Saginaw in Michigan is right about here on the Michigan map. And I have a scar a star-shaped scar exactly at that point in my hand. And he said, "How did you come to have such a symbolic star-shaped scar marking, the geography where you came into this planet?" And we got into a conversation. And then I remembered, and I hadn't thought about it, I guess, for maybe 30 years. It just had been something that I just hadn't thought about at all. And it came back very clear because it's an indelible memory. I was about 8 or 9 months old at the time, and I had a pencil in my hand. And I was born in October of 1940, and this was probably around the summer solstice of 1941. And I was apparently crawling up these stairs, and I had slipped, or made a slip, or a fall, and the pencil had gone through my hand, all the way through the hand, because I have the star-shaped scar on both sides of the hand. It had gone all the way through, baptized by the stylus. Sometimes Mother Nature grabs you by the throat. And in that severe pain and shock, sudden as it was, and because of the age that I was, still a crawler, still at 7 or 8 months, children do not have their whole nervous system in sync, so that the shock went directly to the more transpersonal areas. And that was my first experience of very high Dharma. And I can remember exactly, as one would from a very high yogic view, exactly the detailing, the color, the smells, the events, the feeling tones, the awareness of the population of the house, living beings and so forth, the lace curtains blowing slightly in a window that was there at the stairwell. I can remember hearing myself scream, and I can remember being picked up and taken upstairs and the pencil taken out, and I remember all of it very clearly. Even the ride swaddled up, held by a worrying mother, being taken to a doctor. I remember it was an old white-haired woman doctor, and I could read her name, although at the time it didn't mean anything to me. I can now read it through the pristine memory of it, Dr. Longstreet. And in 1941, physicians still purified their instruments by one of these cases that had a green light in it, sort of like an ultraviolet green light. And I can remember her taking various instruments out, and I can still see her making little sutures and looking up at me, surprised to see me watching the whole event. And I can still see her puzzling in her eyes, does he see this? And then her talking to me very nicely, and going on a hunch, she began explaining to me that this is what we do. We sew this up and make a suture, and that the body will heal, and then we'll take the suture out, and everything will be returned. And I can remember her telling me this and taking it in and thinking, thank you very much for the explanation. Sturgeon was the kind of individual who brought this out. He brought out the gut reality, as it were, of people and events, and sustained it. He had such an incredible array of jobs and background. His first job that he made money at was as a trapeze artist. He was fantastic on the high wires. He could do these double flip somersaults and catch the young lady and swing back. And even though he was only, my size, he was tremendously strong as a young man. He, at the age of 18, became a very famous writer of fantasy. It turned out that Sturgeon was one of these prodigies. And 1937, 1938, 1939, 1940, Sturgeon published about 25 or 30 stories as a young teenage prodigy. In all of the magazines, like Unknown, I brought an issue of the October 1939 Unknown, that you can look at later, and it has a story. The cover story is The Elder Gods by Don Stewart, which was a pen name for John W. Campbell Jr., who became the publisher of Astounding Science Fiction, the editor. And one of Sturgeon's stories is in here, and it's called A God in a Garden. All of his stories have a kind of a religious quality to it, as I've said, and the quality grows as one got to know his style. But the Second World War came along, and Sturgeon, like most young men at that time, joined the armed forces, and he had the incredible fortune, or misfortune, to be put into a CB group. And he was a bulldozer operator. And they left him and a bunch of his buddies periodically on these islands in the South Pacific to build airstrips. They had to build these airstrips because the U.S., of course, towards the end of the Pacific War, just rolled across the Pacific because they had prepared logistically, and this was one of the most unsung and yet massive invasions of all time, to move several million men across the whole Pacific Ocean in coordination was at least as important in ending the Second World War as any of the battle victories. It convinced the Japanese that the American know-how was simply unbeatable. Well, Sturgeon was one of these individuals, and one of the stories that came out of this experience was a story called Killdozer, about a bulldozer that becomes infected by an alien who's been trapped in this rock for millions of years, an electrical alien, and this bulldozer hits it, and of course the alien, being electrical, has no prejudice whatsoever. It'll go into an inorganic machine just as well, and then energize it. And this bulldozer tries to kill all the men on the island. They made a movie with Clint Eastwood out of that story. But this is indicative of the kind of mind that Sturgeon had, this quality of discovering the humane everywhere, even in the most unlikely places. He developed incredibly after the Second World War as one of the really great science fiction writers. Sturgeon is one of the big five, as they say: Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, A.E. Van Vogt, Ray Bradbury, and Theodore Sturgeon. They were the makers of the golden age of science fiction. And while Asimov and Heinlein and Van Vogt went in for the large epic struggles, Bradbury and Sturgeon together were individuals who went in for the short story, the weird event, the strange revelation, something that in 5 or 6 pages or 10 pages would cause you to wonder, the kind of wonder that philosophy begins with. And in fact, the first collection of Sturgeon's work was published in 1948, and it was called Without Sorcery. And Bradbury wrote the introduction. At that time he hadn't met Sturgeon yet. And he describes in here what he thinks Sturgeon must be like. He says, Sturgeon has many of the attributes of a magnificent firecracker string ending with a loud 12-incher. There are sparklers and wondrous snakes and Venusian cones of invention, humor and charm in his stories, and before essaying your journey through this book and its attendant wonders, it may well reward you to have your glands x-rayed, for it is evident that Mr. Sturgeon writes with his glands. And if you do not read with your glands functioning healthily, then this is no book for you. Now, writing with the glands is a precarious occupation. Many a good writer has tripped over his gut, you might say, and plunged to a horrible death, vanishing in writhing messes of tripe, down with the maw of his black, monstrous, evil typewriter. But this is not true of Sturgeon, for it is evident that his viscera, at midnight, cast a most incredible glow upon all nearby objects. In a world of mock pomp and towering hypocrisy, it is wonderful to find stories written not only with the large and wrinkled object above the eyes, the brain, but most particularly with the zestful ingredients of the peritoneal cavity, which is the stomach lining. And then he describes Sturgeon. He says, "Someday I hope to meet Sturgeon. I shall take me a walking trip across the Midwest and the East, down country roads and along sycamore lanes, stopping by every old stone bridge to listen and look and wait. And perhaps one summer afternoon, in the silence of which such days partake, I shall look down, and beneath a shale arch I shall find Mr. Sturgeon, busily writing away with pen and ink. It will be hard to find him, for I have not as yet figured out what sort of bridge he prefers, the tall, metal, soaring architectural bridges like those of Brooklyn and San Francisco, or the little forgotten moss-covered creek bridges in hometown ravines where mosquitoes sing and the silence is green. When I have figured the two halves of his split writing personality, I shall start my trek, and if it is night, when I come upon some lone bridge somewhere, I shall recognize his hiding place by the pure, shining glow of his viscera, making a light you can see across the furthest night meadow and hill." That was Bradbury's description of him in 1948. Phosphorescent viscera. When the news came of Sturgeon passing, I had the reaction, the response that one would have of having a brother die. And Sturgeon and I talked many times about spirit families, of how many of us are related to others in terms of spirit families rather than physical families, and that these spirit families include aliens as well as human beings, and they include, of course, human beings from other times. And very often this quality of spirit family is where our sense of intuition works most adequately. I myself first came across the realization that spirit families existed in Canada. I was about 30 years old at the time, and I had gone up to Calgary, Alberta, in the most unusual of circumstances. I'd been hired out of San Francisco State to design a humanities program for a new college that was being built. It wasn't just a college, it was going to be it turned out to be a spaceship more than anything else. It was a futuristic building designed to be about 100 years ahead of its time, and it was built by Stanton Leggett Associates out of Chicago, who built that monster Chicago City College, which is surrounded by freeway exchanges on all sides, so that you can't really walk to Chicago City College. You have to drive in by the freeways, and it is sort of a space age type building. Well, the building that they built in Calgary was supposed to outdo this by another 100 years, and the province of Alberta had become filthy rich because of oil. They call them the blue-eyed sheiks up there. The province of Alberta had so much money that it had given tax refunds to every citizen of Alberta 2 years in a row, $9,000 per person. No taxes, and we'll pay you. Well, this was ruining the economy, because with people so filthy rich, there wasn't much need to work. And they soon began to revise this, and they decided that they were going to spend the money on schools and hospitals and roads. They would develop the whole province of Alberta. And they wanted the best of everything. And so they decided to build a showcase school, a college that would be a beacon and a lantern to education for the next 100 years. So they brought in the most expensive and far-out architects they could, and they designed a building that was not to have classes. It was not to have the regular education, but learning was to take place as a unity throughout the structure. In fact, the structure was to have no walls except the outside walls, and it was to be a 15-acre building with 3 large levels, about 50 feet high, and these interpenetrating flowing levels were to be illuminated by tremendous skylights so that the campus, as well as the program, would be completely open and fluid, and that the education would take place in the following manner: that the library, largely audiovisual materials, would be distributed in kiosks throughout this whole space, educational space, and that the teachers would no longer be teachers in a classroom or have classes, but they would wander at will and free through this matrix, through this structure. And the student population then would surge freely through this structure, permeated by technological access to all information, and have wandering teachers in this matrix, in this stew, to ask about anything at any time. Well, as you can imagine, this raised holy hell with the faculty at their meetings. How can we teach? We got no classroom. We've got no students. We have no class load. And as the school was being built, I went up there in 1970, and the school was finished in 1971. As the school was being built, more and more, the whole faculty and the administration started hedging on this plan, started modifying it. Well, if we can't have classrooms, at least we have to have movable walls. We have to have, and eventually they settled for 5-foot height. I don't know why it was 5 foot. It was some psychological profile that they tapped, and they said that 5-foot heights would not cut anything off, and yet if you sat down, that would be like a wall. And so they manufactured several thousand of these curving, arced, 5-foot high panels. Well, because these panels were so conspicuous, they decided to cover them. And they looked for a color that would enthuse the students, and they turned out to have royal purple. So they covered all these panels with royal purple, kind of flannel-like material. And then, because it was such a bold color, they had to change the color of the indoor-outdoor carpeting, which originally was sort of like a slate beige. They turned it into fireball orange. So there was 15 acres of fireball orange, and about 2,000 or 3,000 of these bright purple walls. Actually, they were about 6 feet long, and they curved, like, just enough of like a hand, like that. Politics, as usual. And about 6 months before we opened the school, the faculty had finally decided that there need to be offices. At least there need to be retreats for the faculty. If we can't have classrooms, there must be offices. And so when they got offices, the next step was the offices must be integrated. The offices must definitely then be collected around a department. And departments need department chiefs, and department chiefs need budgets, and there you had the beginnings of an economic tyranny. Because once all the monies were dispersed to department budgets, there was no one left outside of that matrix, out of that grid, as it were, except yours truly. I had no department. Or rather, I was the department. My assignment from the beginning was to design an integration program of 16 cycles of education that would integrate this whole mess together, keep the unity. So I was the only one who was really at home in this freedom, this educational freedom. And the other several hundred faculty members were extremely interested in seeing me fail this. Well, this situation began to be rather noticeable to me. I was referred to more and more as the fast gun from San Francisco, come up to shoot it out with the local boys, and that I should go home. And they hoped that my programs would fail. And I thought, there's probably a good chance about this because no one's ever done programs like this anyway. But it was about that time that I met my spirit mother. And I didn't know she was my spirit mother till she told me. Her name was Madame Valda. This is a photograph of her at age 79. She went back and got her degree at age 79. Valda was quite an interesting lady. Her father was a Russian emigre, a Russian royalty. He had to get out of Russia. I think it was one of those times when word got out that the Winter Palace was probably not going to be a comfortable place to be around. And he had gone to Spain with the fortune intact, and he had married a Spanish woman who was of gypsy blood and gypsy descent. And this combination of a gypsy and a count was quite a combination. She was technically born in London, but the family moved when she was just a little baby to France, southern France, on the Riviera, in fact in Nice. And she lived in a huge mansion, and there were just mansions in this section of the Riviera. On one side of her lived the famous authoress Colette, and on the other side lived the philosopher Maeterlinck. And so she grew up in between the Colette and Maeterlinck mansions. She was a wood spirit, a wood sprite. And she used to, as a young girl, dance naked in the moonlight whenever there was a full moon, because they had many acres of grounds. And she told me that one night, unbeknownst to her, she was observed by old Professor Maeterlinck, who the next day, with his long Victorian beard and his Edwardian gait, complimented her on her agility on the lawn. And what a beautiful vision it was, and he hoped she would go on to make ballet her career. She definitely had talent. Well, she took that wonderful insight and aside, and she became a ballerina in Paris. All this before the First World War. And in fact, she was one of the earliest French movie stars when they were still silent. She went on location to Cairo and various other exotic places. Silent movies were quite interesting in those days in France. And she was proposed to by various creatures who came out with huge jewels the size of a palm and disappeared the next day. And it was a wonderful life for her. And then the First World War came, and she fled France, and as circumstance would have it, she went to the second largest speaking French city, which was Montreal in Quebec in Canada. And she made Canada her home after that, because during the 20s and 30s, Valda was a women's organizer in Canada, suffrage movement, and in the 30s organized against the starving Western farmers, and she became extremely famous in Western Canada. When I met her, she was retired, but she had just trained the University of Calgary football team in ballet steps, showing these boys that if you could do ballet steps, you could certainly play much better basketball. And this had been so successful that they took her to Radio City Music Hall in New York with the whole basketball team. And she became a celebrity again. In fact, went back into movie making. She was in some scenes of a Lee Marvin movie called Prime Cut, which was not a very good movie, but she loved being on the set again. She loved getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and packing her lunch and getting herself all set. She was in her late 70s at this time. And she said the important thing is to be fresh and ready on the set. You never know when a bigger role will come up. These old movie stars really had it together. She's the one that brought out the fact to me that spirit families exist, and over a cup of vanilla bean tea one evening in her living room, which looked like a museum, row upon row of objects and everything piled up, she said, "You are my son. You are my spirit son." She said, "I've been looking for you for a long time, a long while, and I have a lineage to pass on to you." And it turned out that she had been adopted, that her spirit father was the last great shaman of the Sarsi Indians, who are a group related to the Blackfeet. And her spirit father was walking buffalo. In Blackfoot language, buffalo is tatanga or totonka. If you're speaking of a stationary buffalo, it's totonka. But tatanka mani means a walking buffalo. It means one who is moving. The nouns and verbs and everything change in Blackfoot. There's an inflection so that dynamic objects have a different quality from stationary objects, and imaginary objects have yet a different quality. There are all kinds of fourth and fifth person declensioning in Blackfoot. It's very complex language, very sophisticated. Anything 30 or 40,000 years old gets very sophisticated. Tatanga Mani died at age 97, and one of the great triumphs of his life was attending the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. And he took it as a sign that mankind was getting ready to be a single family, because he thought the World Parliament of Religions, which was a great event, we have the book here from that, it's about an 800-page thick book. I think you might have heard about it. They had representatives from all over the world. The representative from India, one of them was Swami Vivekananda. So many of these religious individuals got together in Chicago, and Tatanga Mani represented the American Indian religions. He was the representative, and he had felt that in his lifetime it was up to him to pass on the integrity of the American Indian religion. When he got to be 97, and events hadn't turned out that way, he felt that somehow his timing must be off. And so he had adopted Madame Valda not only as his spirit daughter, but had initiated her as a medicine woman, because she was really somebody with this. I used to teach a class on divination, and a lot of my students one time were getting into practicing their tarot card reading, and I took them over to her house, and they went through their tarot card reading procedures for her, and she watching them, then took out a regular deck of cards. She said, "You don't need tarot cards." And in fact, she said, "You don't have to look at the cards." So she turned them over, and on the backs of the cards laid out a spread, and then silently, moving and counting in number relation with herself, she began reading the fortunes of all the individuals there down to a T. And she was showing them that the relationalities are not based on physicality at all. That it's actually extraneous. You don't need tea leaves or anything. And this, of course, scared my students because they couldn't figure out how it worked or on what basis it worked. Tatanga Mani had adopted Madame Valda and had passed on to her two symbols, religious symbols, which he said, the understanding of which together would be the center of revealing American Indian religion back to the world, the non-Indian world, which is most of the planet. So she had me go down into her basement, and there among the million boxes of things, she had all kinds of cardboard boxes of little pink ballerina shoes from decades of students. She had saved them all. And way back in, past the old musty ballet materials, the pamphlets and the posters and everything, was a package that was tightly wrapped up. And I got it on her directions and brought it up from the basement, and the two of us sat there, and she unwrapped this tough old butcher paper, brown butcher paper wrapping, and inside that were two ceremonial implements. One of them was Tatanga Mani's rattle, and the rattle was a buffalo scrotum that had been allowed to dry so that the testes rattled inside of it. And this was affixed to a specially cut and designed willow branch, so that with the number coordination and the length and all of this, the sound of the fertility of the buffalo was there in that implement. And this was the sistrum, as it were, for sealing the sacredness of the ceremonial event and protecting it against intrusion and outsiders. The other implement that was in there was the headdress that you see in this photograph of walking buffalo. And this headdress was the cranium top of a buffalo with the skull fragment intact and the hide, the hair. Buffalo hair is deep, rusty, reddish brown. And it had been in this package at that time for about 7 years after he had died. And it was still a vibrant, almost oily, reddish brown vitality. The hair was vital. And of course the blackened buffalo horn still attached to the skull. And this implement, when put on, is a seal of man in his physical realm, carrying him back into the natural horizon. If one looks closely at the shape and scale of Tatangamani's hide helmet, one can see that this shape has been seen before. In fact, this kind of ceremonial implement is preserved in one other portion of the earth, and that is in Tibet, because it is the same crown, the same red furred crown of the what we refer to as the abominable snowman, the Yeti, which is a archaic remnant of man, still alive, not too many left. And this ceremonial of sealing man's physical nature by wearing such an implement, and then with the rattle of allowing himself to transcend spiritually through that seal, so that nothing profane, nothing material goes through this osmosis. Everything that is here of this realm stays, and what is not of this realm is free to fly. And these were the two implements. Tatangamani, realizing what was happening to the American Indian, had duplicates of these made. And sure enough, when he died, the government of Canada went in with barrels of money and bought what they thought were his implements and put them in the National Museum in Ottawa. And of course they were the fakes. And she showed me these implements, saying, "When I die, you make sure that these implements are buried, for they will have accrued a power, and their power is an emanation power, which must not be dispersed. So when I die, these implements must be buried so that they will not fall into profane hands. Because the spirit line that is developing now with Tatangamani and myself, and now you, must continue. That this has some function in the future. We don't know how far in the future, but it must continue." And within about 3 years of that, she died. She was perfectly healthy until her husband, Ross, of 86 years of age, died, and then she figured that her life pattern was finished, and within 2 weeks she was dead. She just let go of it. I went to see her in the hospital the last day, and she was lying supine in the bed, and because she was very famous, there were all kinds of reporters and famous Canadian personalities in the room milling around, as many people as are here. And I made my peace mentally with her, and I turned to go, and as I turned to go to the door, I saw her eyes open on the bed, and I looked over at her, and she turned her head and she looked right at me, and then she closed her eyes, and I left the room. She had told me that she would come back again, and that I would recognize her when she came back. She died in February of 1974, and in June of 1974, on the solstice, I was picking up my adopted daughter, and as I picked her up, I could feel that flow. It was just like an electric current. There it is. This is in that lineage, that she is my spirit daughter, that lineage goes on, and now is in its 4th generation, and that for whatever purposes, that those timeline beings, those of you who have been coming to the Alexandrian series are familiar now with the notion of timeline beings, that we are not just limited to this physical form whatsoever. And it's not that our personality reincarnates so much as that karmic sine wave continues its vibratory motion until there is a purposefulness achieved. Sturgeon was one of the few individuals who understood this and brought this out again and again, the fantastic mystery that is ourselves. Not that surrounds us, but that is ourselves. And the way in which events seem to indicate that in the future, man will transform and change his nature. And that one of the changes that is coming, as we began tonight, is the achievement of an interpenetrative being made up of many individuals, what was called in More Than Human Homo Gestalt. That this is the being of the future. Well, when I heard that Sturgeon had passed away 2 weeks ago, I did a long meditation with him. The first thing one should do when hearing this is to send out a sealing energy. Not so much a prayer or not so much a beseeching, but a sealing energy. In the Tibetan tradition, in the Vajrayana tradition, the sound that one sends out is the syllable Hri. Hri. Hri is the syllable for heart energy. The Hridaya Sutra is the Heart Sutra, the Hri. And the Hri is sent out as like a magnetic sealing shape. And one visualizes that naturally it is sent out to stop up the 9 orifices of the body so that the body is kept integral. The nostrils, the eyes, the mouth, the ears, and the genitals. And to visualize sealing that up so that the natural is kept together. And the second function of that Hri is to develop the resonance of that unity, because it is the resonance that transcends, not the physicality, but the resonance of it. And the resonance can only come when there's a unity. It's only a unity. This is the symbolism of the bell. It's only a unity that vibrates, that is able to carry this resonance, that then emanates. And so the unity is important, but the resonance is what transcends. So I was doing that, and it occurred to me that Sturgeon's qualities that I had experienced should be put into an expressive form appropriate to his life's work. And out of this came a short story written in the Theodore Sturgeon style, which I'd like to read to you. It's not very long. I think it's about 2,500 words. It's what they call a short. But this is a story written with Sturgeon in mind, in style as well as in content. And I hope you get a little bit of enjoyment out of it. Its title, significantly, is Theodore in Winter. Elizabethan enough. Here it is. The station was sophisticated. It had to be. This was the only scientific project on the planet. All that work
collecting, analyzing, synthesizing. Sure, the station was good. But just to watch over things, Theodore was placed on board. Theodore had everything an android desired. Normally, this statement reads the other way. Theodore was everything man desired. But you would never put it so colloquially after watching Theodore work. And he was made, specifically, strategically, to think in new ways. Creative programming or something. They had names and designations at the place where Theodore was assembled, deep in 21st century Los Angeles, some hidden ravine and deserted hills off a secret canyon. But those names and designations are still top security. In fact, now more than ever. No background on the station whatsoever was released, which might also be just as well. On the planet, radioactive methane crystals were the natural storm element. That is, along with the 300-kilometer-per-hour winds. And the jagged surface, blasted for days on end, granulated the stuff into sharp dust, deadly to life forms, all life forms. Only the station and the android were synthesizing any activity. The rest of the planet was lifeless. Oh yeah, we all thought that. The Los Angeles firm in charge of the mining exploration, the government officials, everybody here in emergency procedures. There was not one person in EP who predicted trouble. I mean, the eventuality. We've just got to keep this thing within protocol language. According to Theodore's tapes, he recorded the entire sequence. And maybe that was the beginning problem. He forgot nothing. Anyway, Theodore was sitting in the North Observation Dome, 16 years into the project, when the warning lights signaled intruders somewhere in the eastern vents, ground level 0. Theodore had never seen the intruder signal light up, except in some Canoga Park test routine way back when. So naturally, logically, he sealed off the entire eastern quadrant. The video probes showed nothing, and the heat sensors were nominal, but the progression of intruder signals definitely showed something lurking now inside the vents near the folding and gathering desks. All right, reasoned Theodore, it's cold-blooded as hell. The tapes clearly show this distinct phrasing. Unsatisfied with the video probes, Theodore got up and walked toward the armament kiosk on level 4. He had to go there physically because there was no circuitry for the event. No matter, thought Theodore, I'll go in person. In person is audible on the tape emulsion matrix, despite efforts in some security scan to erase this to a blip. Once armed, Theodore decided to have a look-see for himself. This is a remarkable vocabulary entry, really showing here already some primordial influence on his multifactic code emplacements or something. Of course, there were no lights in the F&G area, never needed. Some group caught it for sure over this one. But Theodore brightened his eyes, and the sweet beams of laser energy, modified by the multifactic code translators into a sort of rainbow hue, swept in 2 coordinated parallel beams through the abject darkness, our adjective. The illumination disclosed the long corridor, the wall units, the floor dusty and moist. Theodore noted a possible leak, a defective seal perhaps. The snake-like sealing apparatus hummed softly. The light disappearing into the darkness. Disappearing into the darkness. Down the tubes. Abyss. All 3 entries are montaged at this point, along with some very peculiar waveform indentations, which read out in no computer language whatsoever. Theodore had arrived at the eastern vents, standing, gun ready, in the darkness, his eyes sweeping the scene, reverberant with the soft thrumming of the support coils. He was quite alone, he deduced, and apparently that bothered him, his word. The sensors clearly read intruder, but his were the only footprints in the moist, dusty floor. All right, reasoned Theodore. It floats. Remaining motionless for half an hour, the android replayed all his tapes looking for analytical clues. The station was now recording the path of progress of something moving inward. Yes, toward the integration centers in the middle, level 6. That something must be identified, thought Theodore, running now in the darkness. Identified. The entry was triple asterisk, and a whole new logical unit of inquiry was begun. Because of the symbiotic relationship between android and station, all of that file was relayed to the station. Theodore kept only a tactical matrix open for himself. Is this a clue? He was still running in the darkness on level 6 when the realization managed to reach red light awareness. The lights were off all over the station. Theodore tapered off his gallop to a casual jog and then stopped, waiting again in the darkness. How can the lights be off? True, there were no fixtures near the F and Gs, but here was the main access corridor outside the integration modules. He turned his head until his beams showed a darkened bubble overhead 10 feet off. Out. He turned his head 180 degrees and 20 feet down the other way. Out. Turning to a wall panel, Theodore placed his palm in the magnetic glove opening, keying into the circuitry. A pleasant flow indicated power, but still no lights. He turned his palm right 90 degrees. No flow. So the helium atmosphere was off. His mind checked his pivots and found them down 15%. Trouble. He turned his palm left 180 degrees. His eye beams flared. Circuits stressed instantly. Instinctively, Theodore's defensive web closed his hand into a fist, neutralizing the contact. His fist slipped out of the dark wall glove into the rapidly pulsing flare of his laser beams. The shock had continued to surge in the palm circuits. Theodore recorded, "I'm trembling." Then the comparison feeds coalesced suddenly, and Theodore knew what he was up against. "No magnetic vampire is going to suck my circuits," shouted Theodore. We know he shouted out loud in the darkened machine silence because we have both the audio wave impression all along that corridor and even on sections of the one above it, plus the faint parallels close to them indicating an echo. To get an echo on 3 acres of instrumentation, Theodore was rather emphatic, or as Jake in Psionics put it in the margin of his report, desperate. Theodore had crossed a line. His circuitry had been programmed to fit the station. Now the station was infiltrated, sick. Something had to be done to restore order. Searching his memory disks, he recognized the need to be prepared while thinking out his strategy, his approach. So he found himself going back to the armament kiosk on level 4. On the way, his logic keeping pace with his long, quick strides, the machinery flashing by, caught his peripheral attention. This clue, associative and subtle, sparked his integral core. In sympathy, his memory began rerunning the recent events. His mind fanned out, amplifying the context. "Well, now to the game of parentheses," muttered Theodore. Each set of sequences were now arranged target-like one within another, and each matrix was montaged in revolving permutations upon each other. Theodore in this way built up a background, a web of intrigue, it turns out, from later developments. As he was gathering possible tools, weapons, Theodore found he had no place to put all these things. On an associative sidetrack, bypassed, he received the image for this eventuality. Thus he laid out a long belt of ribbing, laid on the floor, and fastened the tools and weapons along its length. Next, this was gathered up, arms spread wide, looped over his head onto the left shoulder, let drape, and finally closed with a press-on catch. And just to be extra careful, Theodore reached for the knife he had used to fashion the belt. And now he turned to go, but happened to see his reflection in a polished bulkhead. And there he was, 7 feet, handsome, ready, with a bandolero across his chest and knife at the ready. His eyes pearled. He recognized a hidden image. Something not out front in the programming. This was a content between the lines, nuances, an image recognition from deeper sources. He flashed on it. The mind of the programmer. This was a previously hidden image. Bandolero? As he repeated the word aloud, he checked his vocabulary. Not there. It had occurred with the image. They came up together. More words were now within reach. Guerrilla fighter. Freedom struggle. Theodore's lasers were opalescent. Now we'll show them, he said. We, he thought. Wow. The programmers were with him all the way. No problem. Evidently such an emergency had been foreseen. They really knew their stuff, these men. Heroes. Theodore began moving out. Heroes, heroes. The new words sang with the humming snake coils along the corridor ceiling, punctuating its cyclic drone like a lead singer. Lead singer. Heroes, guerrilla fighter, freedom struggle. Theodore put more amplification between the lines, feeding it energy and vectoring purpose. To hell with the rules. This is an emergency, shouted Theodore in simulation triumph. The station was going to be saved. Moving quickly, he found his way back to the original intrusion, the eastern vents. Outside, a storm was brewing. Tiny, frozen, methane drops, crystallized, pulverized, were being driven as weird sleet against the exterior. This minute hail caused a white sound hush effect. There, in the darkness, the android must have been playing back for himself older, more primordial programs. Matrix set after disk integration set, the earliest multifastic code banks had probably been reviewed in utter darkness. No visuals go with this part of the record. Instead, the auto has this weird tapestry of the storm's hiss and the station's hum. 4 or 5 hours of this. Then he must have discerned a discrepancy. A dull red glow flickered on. Intruder. By his remote connections, Theodore clocked the delay. 2 minutes until the intruder alert was flashed in the North Observation Dome. But it never came on in the South Observation Dome, despite waiting 10 minutes more. In fact, only 2 spots showed the warning, here and there. The records had revealed this pattern before. Limited response was theoretically impossible. Something basic was wrong. Theodore shifted his knife to point into another direction of the dark corridor. This selection of warning signals was definitely meant for him to see. It only concerned the android. That is, the android and these 2 points in the station. Weird. Weird, said Theodore softly. As before, the station's alert system began indicating the ingress of something. Theodore watched the unmolested dust and moisture down a 1/4 mile of corridor. His telescopic vision followed the warning lights as they came on. Again, the video synchronized, now to his eyes, showed the movement towards level 6, integration center. Identified, murmured Theodore. There was nothing there, except in the station's own circuitry. Theodore turned to face the nearest vent. Its 30-yard height dwarfed him. Moving carefully forward, he pushed on a safety release. The lowest panel swung out. A mild breeze blew in from the airlock beyond. Another release, and the storm blasted in. Theodore watched the dark intruder dials. Crystal methane sleet snowed through the airlock into the station, the methane discoloring slightly as it piled in, beginning to melt. No light, no intruder. It wasn't physical. Magnetic vampire, said the android in cool, even tones. He shut both releases. The gas pressure squealed twice, then silence. No, the station hummed. Then Theodore heard it. He jumped up, knife ready, eyes brightened down the corridor. A shriek echoed in the elevator at the far end. "Lord save us," muttered Theodore. Where that came from, he didn't know. Some nuance behind some lines learned peripherally in a lost ravine in Los Angeles. The elevator shaft became phosphorescent. Dimly, the pattern of the station's humming changed. Whatever it was, now was on its way back, confidently. No intruder signals now. No doubt it had integrated into the station itself, infected it, coming fast. If it had got the station, it could get him. No defense, except Theodore hit both releases and dove through the airlock, head first. The discontinuity behind wailed eerily close. Into the storm plunged the armed android, running too fast to hear the releases pop back, sealing up the vent. Well, emergency procedures team arrived to find Theodore camped out in the storm. He had rigged a lean-to over himself, and even a portable heater unit before him like an electronic campfire. Of course, we were surprised to see the knife held out toward the station, and shocked to see his face. You'd swear he was unshaven, like his dour expression sort of got to you. To top it off, he asked for a light. We didn't get that until somebody noticed something rolled up and stuck in his microphone mouthpiece. It was evidently a simulated cigar. We assured Theodore that androids didn't smoke, but he really didn't respond. All this time staring in the station's direction. After several hours of conversation, the bandolero was surrendered, and the phony cigar. The knife, we let him keep, till deactivation back home in L.A. It kind of fit the scene anyway. The reports were long and complex. Apparently, over the 16 years, the android and the station had developed apart. Yeah, even complex machines can't stay married forever. Who would have known this before? They do grow apart. The station had developed a repulsion for the android. Arrogant was one of the odd entries early in its assessment. Over the long, cold years, the station had actually followed its prime directive and had sympathized more and more with the planet. They grew in an odd symbiosis. Theodore was increasingly an alien. The reasoning was strangely sound, too, since the station was so automatic, really near perfect in its functioning. The android keeper had less and less to do. Eventually, it seems, he took to analyzing himself, his own circuits and training. This further provoked the station into considering him vain, or finally, as it was entered, excessive. The way the station figured it, and this was pretty close to the issue, Theodore was verging on a tautological short circuit. Well, the station was not at all ready to follow that. In fact, with the planet as a closer context, friend, entered on the station's main integrator, it hit upon the intruder ruse as a plan to maneuver the android outside. Once there, he would be locked out for good. Actually, the station's main banks did show something like surprise, or even incredulity, to discover us. Our coming back, I mean the fact that this universe contained us, was a rude awakening. The empathy with the planet had blurred all human origins. This was the final point in our conclusion, that even though Theodore was the first android to develop a phobia, the first machine to flip out, the station, more amazingly, was the first machine to go native. God bless Sturgeon's spirit.